Everybody knows what it's like to see a friend fall away or to see a relationship fall apart, right? Sometimes it's really easy to pinpoint an exact cause of why a relationship fell apart, but other times it happens so gradually that you didn't even see it coming. The same thing can happen in our relationship with God. Sometimes we can pinpoint that exact moment that we may have turned away from God, but other times it's hard to say why we felt so distant or when it even began. Jesus once told a story that I think we all need to hear. It's about a son who left home and turned his back on his family, and he decided that he was going to make his life all about him. It was fun for him for a minute, but then he realized that he was lonely, miserable, and broke. So this is another one of those stories that Jesus made up and he told the Pharisees. The Pharisees were religious leaders of the time who had become so arrogant and self-absorbed and so dismissive of people that they would call sinful. And Jesus was trying to help them understand how wrong they were about themselves, about others, and about God. So this story comes from the same chapter that we've been reading in the past few weeks, Luke 15. We're going to start in verse 11. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who then sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything." Verse 17, "When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.'" So this guy basically went to his dad and said, "Hey dad, you're worth more to me dead than alive, so I'll take my inheritance now." Even though the son already had everything that he needed, like food and shelter, he took his inheritance and went off to this distant land where he thought he was going to find everything that he didn't have at home. But in the process, he had thrown away everything that was good in his life. He lost his family, his money, his livelihood, and maybe even his faith. And then he found himself so disconnected from everyone and from God. And then he decided to go back home, and at the very least, he wanted his father to hire him as a servant. He felt so full of shame. As you may have guessed, the story did not end there. Picking up in verse 20. "So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate." Wow, I mean, it literally sounds unbelievable. Can you imagine what it would be like to be welcomed home like this after all the things that the son did? After wasting his money and disgracing his father and bringing shame on his family and on himself, he decided that he was going to come home, and he assumed that his family would reject him. But to his surprise, his father came out and opened his arms and hugged him and kissed him and then threw this huge party. His father forgave him and welcomed him home. And Jesus says that is what God is like. We might walk away, but Jesus always welcomes us back. And remember that Jesus told these stories to teach us about who God is and what God is calling us to do. Personally, I know that I can relate to the son in this story in some ways. How about you? Maybe there was a time that you did something to create distance between you and someone that you love. Maybe you feel distant from God, either because of choices that you've made in the past, or maybe you've never really felt close to God before. Or maybe you've made a mistake and you feel like you've ruined everything. And maybe you feel so full of shame and just wish that things would go back to the way that they were. Like the father in Jesus' parable, God is so kind and loving and patient with us. God isn't some angry old man sitting and waiting to shoot lightning bolts at us whenever we mess up. No, God is like a loving father, always ready to welcome us home. And in case you didn't know, Jesus is God. So when you've made decisions or mistakes that make you feel like you've been led far from God, remember this parable and remember what the son in this parable discovered about his father. When you feel lost, Jesus welcomes you back.